The fluorescent lights buzzed like dying insects over rows of card tables draped in mismatched tablecloths. Nora Patel squeezed between a woman clutching ceramic roosters and a man testing every pen in a mason jar, her eyes scanning for the kind of overlooked treasure that kept her student loans from multiplying like rabbits. The church basement smelled of coffee and mothballs, punctuated by the occasional wheeze of the ancient furnace in the corner. "Everything must go," announced Mrs. Henderson from behind the cashier's table, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had organized decades of potluck suppers. "We're clearing out the old rectory storage before the renovation." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nora had learned to read estate sales like archaeological sites. The good stuff disappeared in the first hour, but sometimes real gems hid in the dregs nobody wanted. She'd made rent last month, flipping a tarnished tea service that turned out to be sterling silver. The month before, it was a box of old books that included a first edition Steinbeck somebody's grandfather had used as a doorstop. In the far corner, wedged between a broken exercise bike and a stack of encyclopedias from 1987, she spotted it. A wooden crate about the size of a milk carton, its corners reinforced with tarnished metal brackets. Someone had written "Lost Library, Misc." Across the top in faded blue ink, the letters slanted and hurried. Nora knelt beside the crate, running her fingers along its edges. The wood was scarred but solid, held together with dovetailed joints that spoke of careful craftsmanship. When she lifted the lid, the hinges protested with a soft groan. Inside, wrapped in what looked like old dish towels, were books and papers in various states of decay. Nothing immediately valuable, but something about the careful way they'd been packed made her pause. "How much for this one?" she called to Mrs. Henderson. The older woman squinted over her bifocals. "That old thing?" "Oh, Father Cruz said to let it go cheap." $6? $6. Nora had spent more on coffee this week. She pulled out a crumpled 5 and a handful of quarters, adding them to the growing pile on Mrs. Henderson's table. "Deal." As she hefted the crate, a tabby cat appeared at her elbow as if summoned. The animal was lean but not starving, with intelligent green eyes and a white patch on his chest shaped like an ink blot. He sniffed the crate with obvious interest, then looked up at Nora with what she could only describe as approval. "That's Gutenberg," said Father Mateo Cruz, emerging from behind a rack of winter coats. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with prematurely grey hair and laugh lines around dark eyes. "He's been hanging around the library since we closed the circulation desk last year. Seems to think he owns the place." "The library?" Father Cruz gestured toward a doorway Nora hadn't noticed before. "The Old Town Library. It's attached to the parish hall. Been decommissioned for years, but we haven't had the heart to strip it completely. Gutenberg has claimed it as his territory." The cat meowed once, then trotted toward the doorway with obvious intent. He paused at the threshold, looking back at Nora with what seemed like an invitation. "He wants to show you something," Father Cruz said with a smile. "Gutenberg's got excellent taste in people. Why don't you take a look around? Just mind the dust." Curiosity won over caution. Nora followed the cat through the doorway and up a short flight of stairs, the crate growing heavier with each step. The library was a time capsule from another era, all dark wood and brass fixtures. Empty shelves lined the walls like the ribs of some great beast, and afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. Gutenberg had disappeared somewhere in the stacks. Nora set down her crate and called softly, "Here, Kitty." The sound echoed strangely in the empty space. A faint scrabbling noise drew her attention to the far end of the room, where a section of wood paneling had warped away from the wall. As she approached, she could hear Gutenberg moving around behind it. The gap was narrow, but when she pressed against the panel, it gave way with a soft creak. Behind the false wall was a crawl space that ran the length of the building. Gutenberg sat in a pool of light from a crack in the foundation, his tail twitching with satisfaction. At his feet was a tarp-covered mound about the size of a steamer trunk. Nora squeezed through the gap, her heart hammering with the kind of adrenaline rush she remembered from her graduate school days. When she pulled back the tarp, her breath caught in her throat. Wrapped in oiled cloth were books and scrolls, unlike anything she'd seen outside of a museum's rare manuscript room. Hand-stitched codices with covers of worked leather. Sealed scrolls tied with ribbon that might once have been read. And underneath them all, a sheet of paper covered in symbols and numbers that made her archival training sing with recognition. A cipher key. Her hands trembled as she photographed each item with her phone, making sure to capture the way they'd been arranged. Someone had been very careful about preservation. The oil cloth had kept the worst of the moisture out, and whoever had hidden this cache had known what they were doing. At the bottom of the pile, she found something that made her pulse quicken. A receipt, yellowed but still legible, stamped with the parish seal and signed in Father Cruz's careful handwriting. Estate materials received from the Whitmore legal offices, December 1987, miscellaneous documents and books for storage pending disposition. Chain of custody, legal ownership. The two things that meant the difference between a treasure and a lawsuit. When she emerged from the crawl space, dusty and exhilarated, Father Cruz was waiting for her in the main library with a cup of coffee and an expression of patient amusement. "Find anything interesting?" he asked. Nora studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. She found neither. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Because most people wouldn't have bothered to follow a cat into a crawl space." He settled into one of the old reading chairs with the ease of long practice. "Gutenberg's been trying to show people that hiding spot for months. You're the first one who actually looked. Do you know what's in there?" Father Cruz shrugged. "Documents from law offices, mostly. They used to bring us things when they were cleaning out old case files. Paper was expensive to dispose of properly, so we'd take it off their hands and sort through it later for anything the Historical Society might want." He paused, studying her face. "But I suspect you found something more interesting than old tax returns." Nora made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and showed him the photos. Father Cruz's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline as he scrolled through the images. "Well," he said finally, "that's not what I expected. I need to have these examined properly. By someone with the right equipment and expertise. Do you know someone like that?" Nora thought of Dr. Elias Romero, quietly brilliant and professionally radioactive. The man who'd been fired from the university for flagging irregularities in donor acquisitions. The man she'd sworn never to contact again after her own spectacular fall from academic grace. Unfortunately, yes. Dr. Elias Romero's conservation lab occupied the converted garage behind his rental house, a space that managed to be both cramped and meticulously organized. Humidifiers hummed in the corners, while grow lights illuminated work tables covered in magnifying lamps, pH meters, and other tools of the paper detective's trade. A kettle sat on a hot plate next to a collection of mismatched mugs. The only concession to comfort in an otherwise rigorously functional space. "I said I'd never work with university people again," Eli said, without looking up from the microscope, where he was examining fiber samples from the scrolls. His voice was soft, almost musical, with the careful diction of someone who chose his words like surgical instruments. "You're not university people anymore, are you?" "Not by choice." Nora perched on a lab stool watching him work. 3 days had passed since she'd driven to his house at midnight, with a cooler full of documents and a story that sounded like academic fantasy. 3 days of careful, methodical analysis that was either confirming her wildest hopes or setting her up for spectacular disappointment. "The paper tells a story," Eli continued, making notes in his precise handwriting. "Local bast fiber mixed with imported rag. That's consistent with frontier paper-making practices in the 1840s through 1860s. The ink," he paused, switching to a different slide. "Iron gall with traces of oak tannin. Very period appropriate. But could it be forged?" Eli finally looked up, his dark eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Anything can be forged if you know what you're doing and you don't care about the cost. But this?" He gestured at the documents spread across light tables like a scholar's tarot reading. "This would require expertise in multiple indigenous languages, historical papermaking techniques, period-appropriate ink chemistry, and access to the right materials. We're talking about a months-long project requiring specialized knowledge and equipment. Or," Nora said, "it's real." The cipher key was the breakthrough, Eli admitted. He led her to a computer where he'd been working to decode the symbols. "Look at this." The screen showed a partially translated text, with gaps where the cipher remained unsolved. But what Nora could read made her breath catch. The boundaries of the sacred ground as marked by the white stones at the confluence of the two streams, extending north to the oak grove where the eagles nest, and south to the red cliffs that overlook the valley. These lands are to remain inviolate according to the agreement signed this day between Governor Whitmore and... The name that followed was in symbols Eli hadn't yet decoded. But the implications were clear. "This is a treaty," Nora whispered. "Part of one, anyway. And if the dating is accurate, it predates every known treaty document for this region by at least a decade." Nora stared at the translation, her mind racing through the implications. The red cliffs that overlook the valley. That's got to be the ridge where Red Cedar Minerals wants to start their new extraction site. Eli nodded grimly. "I thought you might make that connection. Which brings us to the question of what we do with this information. We verify it. We publish it. We make sure it gets to the people who need to see it. And then what?" Eli's voice was gentle but firm. "Do you remember what happened the last time you tried to expose a document fraud? How long did it take for you to get blacklisted from every major archive on the East Coast?" The memory still stung. Dr. Harold Seeger, her dissertation advisor, had been so proud of the medieval manuscript that a generous donor had gifted to the university. It had taken Nora 3 months of careful analysis to prove that the 13th century Psalter had been created in someone's basement workshop. Probably in the 1970s, Seeger's rage had been biblical. The donor had withdrawn funding for the entire medieval studies program. Nora had been quietly encouraged to pursue other opportunities. "This is different," she said. "Is it? Because from where I sit, it looks like you're about to threaten some very powerful people's interests. Red Cedar Minerals alone has enough money to bury us both in legal paperwork. And if that treaty is real, it could invalidate land sales going back decades." Nora looked around Eli's garage lab, at the careful arrangements of tools and chemicals that represented a career rebuilt from the ashes of academic disgrace. She understood his caution, but she also understood what was at stake. "Then we'd better be absolutely sure of our facts before anyone tries to stop us." Eli was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents under the bright light of the examination lamps. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of resolve that hadn't been there before. "There's someone else who needs to see this. Someone who can verify the language and cultural references in ways that we can't." "Who?" "Wanya Greyhawk. She's a tribal historian and language keeper. If anyone can tell us whether these documents are authentic from a cultural perspective, it's her. Will she talk to us?" Eli's smile was rueful. "That depends on how we approach her, and whether she thinks we can be trusted with what she tells us." Before Nora could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she didn't recognize. The caller ID showed only Ivy Crest Museum. She answered cautiously. "Hello?" "Ms. Patel." The voice was crisp, professional, with the kind of patrician accent that suggested private schools and family money. "This is Director Vivian Alcott from the Ivy Crest Museum of Antiquities. I understand you may have come into possession of some documents that would be of interest to our collection. I was wondering if we might arrange a meeting to discuss the possibility of proper preservation and display." Nora's eyes met Eli's across the lab. His expression had gone carefully neutral, but she could read the warning in his posture. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," she said. "Oh, I think you do." There was steel beneath the silk in Alcott's voice. These sorts of discoveries have a way of finding their way to the appropriate institutions, Ms. Patel. It would be so much better for everyone involved if that happened sooner rather than later. Shall we say tomorrow at 2? I can have my car pick you up. The line went dead before Nora could respond. Well, Eli said quietly, that didn't take long. The Ivy Crest Museum of Antiquities occupied a full city block, its glass and marble facade reflecting the late afternoon sun like a modernist cathedral. Inside, the atrium soared 3 stories high, filled with carefully arranged displays that whispered of serious money and serious scholarship in equal measure. Nora's footsteps echoed on polished stone as she made her way to the reception desk. Acutely aware of her thrift store blazer and the coffee stain on her skirt that she'd tried unsuccessfully to scrub out that morning. Ms. Patel. The receptionist's smile was as polished as the marble floors. Director Alcott is expecting you. Right this way. Director Vivian Alcott's office commanded a view of the sculpture garden, where carefully pruned trees framed ancient statuary like living picture frames. The woman herself was tall and elegant, probably in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a style that probably cost more than Nora's monthly grocery budget. She rose from behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany, extending a manicured hand in greeting. Miss Patel, how lovely to meet you. Please sit. She gestured to a pair of leather chairs arranged around a coffee table that held what looked like a genuine Ming vase. I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of having some tea brought in. The tea service was bone china, delicate enough that Nora was afraid to breathe on it too hard. Alcott poured with practiced grace, the ritual giving her time to study her guest with eyes that missed nothing. I understand you've made quite a discovery, Alcott said, settling back in her chair with the easy confidence of someone who owned the room and everyone in it. The sort of thing that requires proper institutional support. I'm not sure what you mean. Alcott's smile never wavered. Come now, Ms. Patel. Word travels quickly in our small community. A young woman purchases a crate at a parish sale, and suddenly there are whispers about documents that predate known historical records. It's the sort of discovery that can make or break careers. The implicit threat was delivered with such honey-smooth charm that it took Nora a moment to register it. When she did, her spine stiffened. Are you threatening me? Threatening? Heavens, no! Alcott laughed, a crystalline sound that echoed off the office's high ceiling. I'm offering to help you. Do you have any idea what's involved in properly preserving and authenticating historical documents? The climate control requirements alone cost thousands of dollars per month. Then there's the scholarly analysis, the publication process, the legal considerations. She paused to sip her tea, letting the implications sink in. Here at Ivy Crest, we have all of those resources at our disposal. Our conservation lab is state-of-the-art. Our scholars are internationally recognized. Our legal department has experience handling provenance disputes and acquisition challenges. What kind of acquisition challenges? Well, there are always questions about ownership when materials surface from estate sales and private collections. The sellers don't always have clear title, you understand. Sometimes families dispute the right to dispose of heirloom materials. Sometimes institutions claim that documents were removed from their collections improperly. Alcott's eyes glittered with what might have been amusement. I'd hate for you to find yourself in the middle of such a dispute, especially given your previous experiences with academic institutions. The blood drained from Nora's face. You've been checking up on me. Due diligence, my dear. It's nothing personal. But given Dr. Seeger's concerns about your reliability when it comes to document authentication, I thought it best to understand what we might be dealing with. Seeger talked to you? Harold and I go way back. He was quite forthcoming about the unfortunate incident with the forged Psalter. Such a shame when a promising career is derailed by, let's call it, excessive zeal. Nora set down her teacup with shaking hands. The delicate china clinked against the saucer like a small bell tolling. What do you want? I want to offer you a way forward that benefits everyone involved. Alcott leaned forward, her voice taking on the tone of a concerned mentor. "Bring the documents here. Let our experts authenticate them properly. In return, we'll offer you a research fellowship, full access to our resources, and co-authorship on any publications that result." "And if I say no?" Alcott's smile grew thin. "Well, as I mentioned, there are often questions about provenance in cases like these. The parish sale, for instance. Did Father Cruz have the authority to dispose of materials that may have originally belonged to other institutions? Were proper legal procedures followed? These are the sorts of questions that tend to arise when valuable historical materials surface unexpectedly. The threat was clear now, wrapped in velvet but sharp as a blade. Nora pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the polished floor. "I need to think about it." "Of course you do." Alcott rose with fluid grace, moving to her desk, where she picked up an elegant business card holder. "But don't think too long, my dear. These sorts of opportunities have a way of evaporating if one waits too long to seize them." As Nora walked through the museum's marble halls toward the exit, her head spinning with anger and fear, she barely noticed the young woman with a press badge who fell into step beside her. "Excuse me," the woman said.
"Are you Nora Patel?"
Nora stopped, wary. "Who's asking?" "Ava Redbird, Central Valley Gazette. I've been covering the Red Cedar Minerals permitting process, and I heard there might be some new historical documents that could impact their project." "I don't know what you're talking about." Ava's smile was knowing. "Look, I get it. Everyone wants to control the narrative. But sometimes the truth has a way of coming out, whether the institutions want it to or not." She handed Nora a business card, her expression serious. "When you're ready to tell your story, call me. Because I have a feeling Director Alcott isn't the only person who's going to come looking for those documents." As Nora walked down the museum's marble steps, her phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender's name made her heart skip. Greyhawkertribalarchive.org. "Ms. Patel, I heard you might have found something of interest to my community. Would you be willing to meet? There are things we need to discuss. Juania Greyhawk." The tribal archive occupied a modest building on the outskirts of town, its cedar-shake exterior weathered to silver grey by decades of high plains wind. Inside, the walls were lined with archival boxes and filing cabinets that spoke of meticulous organization on a shoestring budget. Audio recording equipment shared space with computers that looked like they'd been donated by someone's office upgrade. And the air carried the faint scent of sage and old paper. Juania Greyhawk was younger than Nora had expected, maybe 45, with graying black hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. She moved through the crowded space with the efficiency of someone who knew where every document lived, pulling out files and setting up equipment with practiced ease. "I've been waiting for something like this for 20 years, she said without preamble, spreading the photographs of the scrolls across a work table. "My grandmother used to tell stories about papers that disappeared during the cleanup years. Documents that proved promises were made and then conveniently forgotten. Eli had driven up from the city with the original documents sealed in archival containers, his usual caution warring with excitement at the prospect of proper cultural authentication. He watched nervously as Juania examined the scrolls under a magnifying lamp, her fingers tracing symbols without quite touching the fragile surfaces. "This is definitely Lakota script," she murmured, switching between the cipher key and the partially translated text. "But not the way it's usually written for outsiders. This has ceremonial elements, sacred language mixed with legal terminology." She looked up, her expression grave. "Do you understand what that means? This isn't just a treaty document. It's a covenant. The kind of agreement that carries spiritual weight as well as legal obligation." Nora felt her pulse quicken. "Can you translate the parts we haven't decoded yet?" "Some of them." Juania pulled out a notebook filled with careful handwriting. "The place names are specific to this region. Where the eagle's nest refers to the old oak grove on the eastern ridge. The confluence of the two streams is where Willow Creek meets the main river. And the red cliffs." She paused, meeting Nora's eyes. That's the exact location where Red Cedar Minerals wants to start their extraction operation. Eli leaned forward. What about the name that's still in cipher? The indigenous leader who signed the treaty? Wania's fingers moved across the symbols with the reverence of someone handling sacred text. Running Wolf, my great-great-grandfather. Her voice was steady, but Nora caught the tremor beneath it. He was known as a scholar, someone who understood that agreements had to be recorded in both languages to have power in both worlds. The room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic. Nora stared at the documents spread across the table, beginning to understand the true magnitude of what they'd found. This treaty predates the official land cessions by a full decade, Wania continued. If it's authentic, it means the government broke their own agreement before they even started the formal negotiation process. The land sales, the mineral rights, the museum acquisitions of sacred objects from this region, all of it would be legally questionable. What do we do with that information? Nora asked. Wania studied her for a long moment. That depends. Are you asking as someone who found something valuable, or as someone who understands that knowledge carries responsibility? The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Nora thought of Director Alcott's velvet threats, of the research fellowship that would restore her academic reputation, of the safe path that lay in institutional cooperation. I want to do the right thing, she said finally. But I'm not sure I know what that is. The right thing, Wania said softly, is to let the descendants of the people who made this agreement decide how their ancestors' words should be shared with the world. She moved to a file cabinet and pulled out a folder thick with legal documents. We've been fighting the Red Cedar permits through proper channels for 3 years. Environmental impact studies, cultural surveys, legal challenges. But courts don't tend to give much weight to oral histories, no matter how carefully they've been preserved. But they would give weight to written documentation. If the chain of custody is solid, if the authentication is unquestionable, if the community that made the original agreement stands behind its interpretation. Eli had been quietly photographing the symbols under different light spectrums, documenting every aspect of the document's physical composition. We should establish a formal chain of custody, he said. Multiple witnesses, time-stamped photography, notarized statements about the discovery location and circumstances. Wania nodded approvingly. And we should do it quickly. Once word gets out that you've found something this significant, there will be pressure from multiple directions to control the narrative. As if summoned by her words, Nora's phone buzzed with an incoming email. The sender's name made her stomach drop. Daniel Kincaid, CEO, Red Cedar Minerals. The message was brief and to the point. Ms. Patel, it has come to our attention that you may have come into possession of certain documents that rightfully belong to Red Cedar Minerals as part of our comprehensive land records research. We would appreciate the opportunity to examine these materials and arrange for their proper return to our archives. Please contact our legal department at your earliest convenience to arrange transfer. Well, Nora said, showing the email to the others. That didn't take long. Wania's expression hardened. Red Cedar has never owned any historical documents relating to this region. That's a fishing expedition designed to scare you into surrendering materials before you can properly evaluate them. It's working, Nora admitted. Eli looked up from his photography. We need to move fast. If we're going to establish proper custody and authentication, we should do it while we still have control of the narrative. For the next 3 hours, they worked with the methodical precision of archivists, building a case that would stand up in court. Wania verified place names, kinship references, and ceremonial language that appeared nowhere in published dictionaries. Eli documented fiber composition, ink chemistry, and construction techniques that matched historical practices. Nora photographed every step of the process, creating a visual record of their methodology. By sunset, they had assembled a preliminary dossier that painted a clear picture. The documents were authentic, culturally significant and legally explosive. The treaty described etchis telling, and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Specific land boundaries that overlapped not only with Red Cedar's proposed mining site, but with several museum acquisitions and private land sales dating back decades. "There's something else," Wania said as they prepared to leave. She pulled out a map of the region marked with colored pins. The ceremonial sites mentioned in the treaty, 3 of them are currently on private land that was sold as vacant parcels. One is underneath the county courthouse, and one, she pointed to a red pin on the eastern edge of the map. One is in the middle of Red Cedar's proposed extraction zone. "Sacred ground," Eli said quietly. "More than that. According to the treaty language, it's protected ground. Land that was never supposed to be disturbed under any circumstances." Nora stared at the map, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "And Red Cedar is planning to strip mine it, starting next month, if their permits go through." As they packed up the documents, sealing them back in their archival containers, Nora felt the weight of what they'd discovered settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about historical accuracy or academic vindication anymore. It was about preventing the destruction of sacred land and honoring promises made by people who were long dead, but not forgotten. "What happens now?" she asked. Wania smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Now we find out how powerful the truth really is when it goes up against money and institutional inertia. And if the truth loses, then we make sure it's preserved for the next generation to fight with." Nora knew she was in trouble when she came home to find her apartment door hanging open like a broken jaw. The lock hadn't been forced. Someone had picked it with professional skill, leaving no scratches on the metal. Inside, the destruction was surgical. Drawers had been pulled out and searched, but nothing was thrown around for show. Whoever had done this was looking for something specific. Her laptop was gone. So was her desktop computer and the external hard drives where she stored her research files. But they'd left her TV, her jewelry, even the emergency cash she kept hidden in a coffee can. This wasn't a robbery. It was a targeted extraction. "Maya," she called her sister, her hands shaking as she dialed. "I need help." Nora Patel arrived within the hour, carrying a toolbox and wearing the grim expression of someone who'd been expecting this call for years. She was 3 years younger than Nora, but infinitely more practical, with the kind of systematic mind that made her invaluable at the public library's IT department. "Professional job," Maya said, examining the door lock with a magnifying glass. "No scratches, no damage to the mechanism. They had keys, or they're very good at what they do. They took all my computers." "Of course they did." Maya began pulling devices out of her toolbox. "Good thing you learned something from your last academic disaster. Please tell me you followed my advice about off-site backups." Nora managed a weak smile. 3 different cloud services, plus encrypted drives hidden in the library. Thank God for paranoid siblings. Maya began installing new locks, her movements quick and efficient. "While I'm doing this, check your online accounts. If they got into your machines, they might have access to your passwords." The next hour revealed the scope of the attack. Someone had indeed accessed Nora's email accounts and social media profiles. Worse, they'd been busy. A quick search of her name revealed a dozen newly created social media accounts, spreading a carefully crafted story. Nora Patel was a disgraced academic with a history of promoting forged documents. She was a hoax broker who preyed on the hopes of indigenous communities by creating false historical narratives for profit. "Look at this," Maya said, showing Nora her phone screen. The posts were sophisticated, mixing just enough truth with fabrication to be plausible. They mentioned her exit from graduate school, her financial struggles, even her thrift-flipping business, but twisted everything to suggest a pattern of deception and desperation. "They work fast," Nora said bitterly, "and they know what they're doing. But so do we." Maya's fingers flew over her laptop keyboard. "I'm documenting everything. Timestamps, IP addresses where I can find them, patterns of posting that suggest coordination. This kind of smear campaign leaves digital fingerprints if you know where to look. While Maya worked, Nora called Eli to warn him that their investigation might have been compromised. His phone went straight to voicemail. When she tried his home number, a mechanical voice informed her that the line had been disconnected. Fear crystallized in her chest like ice water. She grabbed her keys and headed for the door, but Maya caught her arm. "Where are you going?" "To check on Eli. Something's wrong." "Then I'm coming with you." They drove across town in Maya's ancient Honda, the radio playing soft jazz that did nothing to calm Nora's racing heart. Eli's neighborhood was quiet, tree-lined streets where nothing exciting was supposed to happen. But his house was dark, and when they knocked on the front door, no one answered. The garage lab was empty. Not cleaned out, emptied. Every piece of equipment, every chemical bottle, every scrap of paper had been removed, with the same surgical precision that had characterized the search of Nora's apartment. Only the pegboard outlines on the walls remained, ghostly impressions of tools that were no longer there. "They took everything," Nora whispered. Maya was examining the floor with her phone's flashlight. "Not everything. Look." In the corner where Eli's desk had stood, someone had scratched symbols into the concrete floor. They were small, barely visible, but definitely intentional. Nora knelt beside them, her heart hammering with recognition. "It's part of the cipher," she said. "Eli left us a message." The symbols translated to an address across town, followed by what looked like a time, 11 p.m. "It's almost 10:30 now," Maya said. They drove through dark streets toward the warehouse district, past closed factories and empty parking lots. The address led them to a 24-hour storage facility, the kind of place where people kept boats and RVs and things they didn't have room for at home. Unit 47 was at the back of the complex, away from the security lights. When they pulled up, they found Eli waiting in the shadows, looking haggard but determined. "They came for the lab around noon," he said without preamble. "Professional movers with a court order, claiming the equipment was stolen university property. I managed to save the most important analysis files, but everything else is gone. How did you know to hide backup materials?" Eli's smile was grim. 20 years in academia teaches you that powerful people don't like inconvenient truths. I started keeping emergency copies of sensitive work after my first whistleblowing experience. Inside the storage unit, covered by tarps and arranged with meticulous care, were copies of all their documentation. Photographs of the original scrolls, fiber analysis results, translation notes, and chain of custody records. Everything they needed to prove the authenticity of the treaty documents. "We need to move quickly," Eli said. This afternoon, Professor Seeger published a preliminary paper online, claiming that the documents are obvious forgeries. He's using my translation notes but twisting the conclusions. Nora felt rage rise in her throat like bile. "He stole your work. Worse, he's positioning himself as the expert who exposed the hoax, using just enough accurate technical detail to sound credible. By morning, every academic journal in the field will be citing his analysis." Maya had been working on her laptop while they talked. "There's more bad news," she said. "Red Cedar Minerals just filed a complaint with the sheriff's office, claiming that someone broke into their archives and stole proprietary documents. They're saying the scrolls were taken from their legal files and that you're in possession of stolen corporate property." "That's impossible. The documents came from a parish sale. Try proving that when they've got lawyers and you've got a receipt from a church basement." Maya's expression was grim. "They're building a legal case to seize the materials before you can publish anything that threatens their permits." Eli began repacking the documents with careful precision. "We need to get these materials to Wanya and establish community custody before anyone else can claim ownership. If the descendant community asserts stewardship rights, it becomes much harder for outside parties to seize them." "What about the smear campaign?" Nora asked. "We fight it with facts," Maya said. "I've been building a digital dossier of everything we can prove about the discovery and authentication process. Chain of custody, witness statements, technical analysis. When this goes public, we'll be ready. As they prepared to leave the storage unit, Eli's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Dr. Romero, we represent parties interested in acquiring certain historical documents for proper preservation. A generous finder's fee is available for individuals who facilitate appropriate transfers. Discretion assured. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore, Eli said. Nora looked at the message, then at her sister and her unlikely ally, both risking their careers and possibly their safety to help her do the right thing. The smart play would be to take the money and walk away. Let someone else worry about sacred ground and broken treaties and the weight of history. But as she thought about Juania's great-great-grandfather, carefully recording agreements in 2 languages so they couldn't be misunderstood or forgotten, she knew she couldn't do that. No deals, she said. We see this through. Father Mateo Cruz's office in the parish rectory was cramped but tidy, with filing cabinets that dated back to the Eisenhower administration and a coffee maker that probably remembered the Kennedy years. When Nora explained why they needed access to the parish records, the priest listened with the patient attention of someone who'd heard a lot of confessions over the years. The 1987 intake ledgers, he mused, pulling out a ring of keys that could have unlocked a medieval castle. Those would be in the basement archive. Though I should warn you, the organization system down there is more art than science. The basement was a paper archaeologist's nightmare. Boxes stacked on boxes, filing cabinets with labels that had faded to illegibility, and the lingering smell of mildew despite a dehumidifier that hummed in the corner like an old refrigerator. But Father Cruz navigated the maze with surprising confidence, eventually locating a series of ledgers bound in cracking leather. Here we are, he said, opening the 1987 volume to a page marked with a faded ribbon. December entries. Miscellaneous documents and books received from Whitmore Legal Services for storage pending disposition. Signed by my predecessor, Father O'Brien, and countersigned by... He squinted at the faded ink. Attorney James Whitmore himself. Nora photographed the ledger entry with hands that trembled slightly. This was the missing link in the chain of custody. Proof that the documents had passed legally from a law office to the church and then to her through legitimate sale. There's more, Father Cruz said, flipping through several more pages. Here. A follow-up entry from 1988. Materials from Whitmore Estate reviewed. Historical documents of potential interest set aside for future evaluation. Legal files disposed of according to standard retention schedule. Someone separated the historical materials from the routine legal files, Eli observed. That suggests they recognized the significance of what they were handling. Father O'Brien was a history buff, Father Cruz explained. He used to say that God spoke through the written word in more ways than one. If there were documents of historical importance in those files, he would have made sure they were preserved properly. While they worked in the basement, Maya had been monitoring online activity from her laptop in the rectory's main office. The news she brought down was mixed. Good news. Sheriff Briggs agreed to meet with us this afternoon to document the chain of custody officially. Bad news, Director. Alcott's legal team filed a motion claiming the parish sale was invalid because the church didn't have clear title to dispose of potentially valuable historical materials. On what grounds? Father Cruz asked, looking genuinely puzzled. They're arguing that materials donated to the church for temporary storage remain the property of the original donors or their heirs. Since the Whitmore family has no surviving members, ownership reverts to the state as unclaimed property. Eli shook his head. That's a stretch. Charitable donations have different legal status, and materials held for over 30 years would typically be considered abandoned property belonging to the holder. Try explaining that to a judge when the other side has a team of lawyers and expert witnesses. Father Cruz closed the ledger with a soft thump. Then we'd better make sure Sheriff Briggs has everything she needs to establish a clear record of legal possession. Sheriff. Lenora Briggs turned out to be a woman in her 50s with graying brown hair and the kind of steady gaze that suggested she'd seen everything at least twice. She listened to their story without interruption, occasionally making notes in a pocket notebook that looked like it had survived several tours of duty. "Let me make sure I understand this," she said when they finished. "You bought a crate at a parish sale, found additional materials hidden in the old library, and these materials may prove the existence of a previously unknown treaty that could impact current land use permits." "That's correct," Nora said. "And now you've got a museum, a mining company, and at least one university professor all claiming ownership of materials that were legally purchased from a church that had legitimate possession for over 30 years. Also correct, Sheriff." Briggs studied the documents they'd spread across the rectory's conference table. She photographed each page, each ledger entry, each piece of evidence in their chain of custody documentation. Her methodical approach was reassuring after days of academic scheming and corporate pressure. "I'm not an expert on historical documents," she said finally, "but I am an expert on property law and evidence handling. Based on what you've shown me, you have a stronger legal claim to these materials than any of the outside parties trying to seize them." "What about Red Cedar's claim that the documents were stolen from their archives?" Maya asked. "Have they produced any evidence that they ever owned these specific materials? Purchase receipts, insurance records, catalog entries?" "Not that I've seen." "Then their claim is worth exactly what they paid for it." Briggs's smile was thin but genuine. "Which appears to be nothing." As they prepared official custody receipts and evidence logs, a quiet knock on the rectory door interrupted their work. Father Cruz answered it to find a young man with kind eyes and nervous hands carrying what looked like a scientific instrument case. "I'm Jonah Park," he said hesitantly. "I work at the Metropolitan Museum's Conservation Lab. I heard, that is, someone mentioned that you might have documents that needed independent authentication." Eli looked up sharply. "Did Director Elcott send you?" "God, no." Jonah's laugh was short and bitter. "Elcott and I don't exactly see eye to eye on acquisition ethics. I'm here because I think historical documents should be evaluated based on evidence, not institutional politics." He set down his case and began unpacking what looked like a portable chemistry lab. "I can do preliminary fiber dating, ink composition analysis, and construction technique evaluation. Pro bono, and completely off the books as far as my employer is concerned." Sheriff Briggs watched him work with obvious interest. "Will your analysis results be admissible in court?" "If I follow proper chain of custody procedures and document everything according to forensic standards." Jonah began setting up his equipment with practiced efficiency. "Which I will." For the next 2 hours they worked in focused silence. Jonah ran microscopic fiber samples through his portable analyzer, tested ink composition with chemical reagents, and examined construction techniques under magnification. All the while, Sheriff Briggs documented every step with photographs and notes that would satisfy any court's evidence requirements. "Preliminary results," Jonah said finally, looking up from his instruments with obvious excitement. "Paper fibers are consistent with mid-19th century frontier manufacturing. Ink shows iron gall composition with trace elements matching period formulations. Construction techniques, especially the binding methods, match documented practices from the 1840s, 1860s. Could these be modern forgeries?" Sheriff Briggs asked. "Anything's possible with enough expertise and resources. But we're talking about a level of authenticity that would require months of work by someone with advanced knowledge of historical papermaking, ink chemistry, and cultural linguistics. The cost alone would be prohibitive unless someone expected to make millions from the fraud. And who would profit from faking documents that threaten a billion-dollar mining deal?" Eli asked pointedly. Jonah packed up his equipment with the satisfaction of someone who'd done good work. "I'll have complete analysis results within 48 hours, everything documented according to forensic standards and ready for legal proceedings. As the sun set behind the stained-glass windows of the parish hall, Sheriff Briggs signed the last custody receipt and closed her evidence folder. "Ms. Patel," she said, "you now have legal documentation of ownership and preliminary expert authentication. If anyone tries to seize these materials without proper legal authority, they'll be committing theft." What happens next? Next, we wait to see who blinks first. But in my experience, bullies tend to back down when they realize their targets know how to fight back. As they prepared to leave the rectory, Gutenberg appeared from wherever cats go during important human business. He wound around Nora's legs with obvious affection, then led them back to the old library, where the whole adventure had started. In the light of the setting sun, streaming through tall windows, the empty shelves looked less like a tomb and more like a promise. History wasn't just about the past, Nora realized. It was about the future that could be built on a foundation of truth instead of convenient lies. Her phone buzzed with another threatening email, this one from Red Cedar's legal department demanding immediate surrender of proprietary materials. She deleted it without reading past the subject line. Some battles were worth fighting. Regardless of the odds, the contested ridge looked deceptively peaceful in the pale dawn light. Sagebrush dotted the red earth like sleeping animals, and somewhere in the distance a hawk circled on thermals that rose from rocks already warming in the sun. But the peace was an illusion, broken by the geometric violence of survey stakes driven into ground that had never been marked for destruction. Nora stood beside Wania at the edge of what Red Cedar Minerals optimistically called their future extraction site, watching. Bulldozers idle in the morning mist, like mechanical predators waiting to feed. The machines were larger than she'd expected, painted yellow as sunflowers, and twice as loud as thunder when their engines turned over. "There," Wania said, pointing to a cluster of ancient oak trees about half a mile north, where the eagles nest. "And that outcropping to the south, those are the red cliffs mentioned in the treaty." Ava Redbird adjusted her camera, framing the landscape with the eye of someone who understood that pictures could be weapons. Her live stream had started before sunrise, drawing viewers from across the region who'd heard rumors about missing treaties and broken promises. "The ceremonial ground runs from those trees to that rock formation," Wania continued, speaking directly to Ava's camera. "According to the treaty text, this entire area was designated as protected land. Inviolate, the document says, never to be disturbed." Behind them, a convoy of white pickup trucks approached, kicking up dust clouds that looked like smoke signals in the early light. Daniel Kincaid emerged from the lead vehicle with the rigid posture of a man who'd built his fortune on being right and couldn't afford to be wrong now. He was flanked by men in suits who moved like private security pretending to be lawyers. "Ms. Patel," Kincaid called, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I hope you understand that you're trespassing on private property with materials stolen from our corporate archives." "This is public land," Sheriff Briggs said, appearing at Nora's shoulder with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she stood legally. "And Ms. Patel has documented ownership of materials purchased through legitimate channels." Kincaid's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Sheriff, I have a court order requiring the immediate surrender of documents unlawfully removed from Red Cedar's legal files." He produced a sheaf of papers with theatrical flourish, but Briggs barely glanced at them. "From what jurisdiction?" "Because the last I checked, county property laws still apply in this county. And I'm still the elected sheriff of this county." While they sparred, Nora found herself reading aloud from the treaty translation, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. The words seemed to hang in the space between past and present, between promise and betrayal. The boundaries of the sacred ground as marked by the white stones at the confluence of the two streams, extending north to the oak grove where the eagles nest, and south to the red cliffs that overlook the valley. These lands are to remain inviolate according to the agreement signed this day. Ava's camera captured everything, the landscape that matched the ancient description, the survey stakes driven into protected ground, the bulldozers positioned to destroy what treaty language had sworn to preserve forever. Her viewer count was climbing steadily, shared and reshared by people who understood that some battles were worth watching. This is exactly the kind of obstructionist theater that's been holding back legitimate development for years, Kincaid said, addressing the camera with practiced media polish. These so-called documents are obvious. Fabrications designed to halt a project that will bring jobs and economic development to a region that desperately needs both. But his composure cracked when Jonah Park's overnight express envelope arrived via Sheriff's Department courier, containing the complete forensic analysis that definitively authenticated the scroll materials. Briggs read the key findings aloud for Ava's live stream. Paper fibers consistent with documented frontier manufacturing practices, circa 1847-1863. Ink composition matches iron gall formulations typical of territorial government chancery use. Construction techniques, binding materials, and aging patterns all consistent with authentic mid-19th century document production. Anyone can fake those kinds of technical details, Kincaid protested, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Anyone with months of time, thousands of dollars in materials, and expertise in historical papermaking, ink chemistry, multiple indigenous languages, and territorial legal practices, Juanilla said dryly, all to create documents that would cost their supposed forger millions in lost mining profits. The logic was unassailable, and Kincaid's security team began to shift uncomfortably as Ava's camera documented their increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative. When one of them moved to secure the documents from Nora's hands, Sheriff Briggs stepped between them with the kind of authority that comes from 20 years of diffusing volatile situations. Anyone who interferes with evidence in my custody will be arrested for obstruction of justice, she said quietly. And anyone who threatens witnesses in an ongoing investigation will find out exactly how much I enjoy processing paperwork at 3 in the morning. As the sun climbed higher, transforming morning mist into harsh visibility, the tableau on the ridge began to attract other observers. Environmental activists arrived with signs and water bottles. Local ranchers came to see what the fuss was about. Even some of Red Cedar's own workers began to gather, curious about the standoff that was keeping them from starting their shifts. "This ends today," Kincaid said finally, pulling out his phone to make what sounded like a very expensive call. The power failure at the parish complex began at 2:17 a.m., noted with mechanical precision by Maya's silent alarm system. By 2:23, figures in dark clothing were moving through the old library with practiced efficiency, their LED headlamps cutting through shadows like surgical instruments. They knew exactly where they were going and exactly what they wanted. What they hadn't counted on was Gutenberg. The library cat had been sleeping in his favorite spot on the old circulation desk when the intruders entered. Unlike humans, who might have fled or hidden, Gutenberg did what cats do when their territory is invaded. He became indignant. His yowl of outrage triggered the motion-activated lights Maya had installed, flooding the library with harsh fluorescent reality. The would-be thieves scattered like roaches. But not before Maya's cameras captured clear images of their faces and the Ivy Crest Museum access lanyards hanging around their necks. Within minutes, Sheriff Briggs and 2 deputies were converging on the parish complex with the grim efficiency of law enforcement officers who'd grown tired of being lied to by people in expensive suits. "Let me guess," Briggs said as she examined the attempted entry point. "These weren't law enforcement officers with a proper warrant. Private contractors," confirmed Deputy Martinez, who was photographing the tools they'd abandoned in their hasty retreat. Professional lockpicks, electronic surveillance equipment, and zip-tie restraints. Someone was planning to take more than just documents. Father Cruz arrived still wearing his pajamas and a bathrobe that had seen better decades. His usual gentle demeanor had been replaced by something considerably more steel-edged. "In 40 years of ministry," he said, "I've dealt with drug addicts, domestic violence, and teenagers who thought the church basement was their personal party venue. But I have never had anyone break into God's house to steal historical documents. The attempted theft had an unexpected consequence. It crystallized community opinion in ways that weeks of legal maneuvering couldn't have achieved. By dawn, word had spread through the tight networks of small-town communication, and people began showing up at the parish with casseroles, offers of help, and the kind of quiet anger that builds over generations of watching outsiders take things that don't belong to them. They overplayed their hand, Maya observed, reviewing the security footage on her laptop. Breaking into a church crosses a line that even corporate lawyers can't spin away. The documents themselves had been moved to the county courthouse vault the previous evening, sealed under court order and protected by the same security systems that guarded evidence in major criminal cases. But the attempted theft proved that someone was desperate enough to risk criminal charges rather than allow the treaty materials to see daylight. Sheriff Briggs used the incident to obtain a warrant for Ivy Crest, museum's employment records, communications logs, and contractor payments. Within hours, she had documented a clear chain of evidence linking the museum to the break-in attempt. Director Alcott is claiming the contractors acted without authorization. Briggs reported during an emergency meeting in the parish rectory. But somehow they had museum access credentials and detailed knowledge of where the documents were stored. Plausible deniability, Eli said grimly. The corporate approach to criminal activity: maintain enough distance to avoid legal consequences while ensuring the job gets done. Ava Redbird had been documenting everything. Her regional newspaper suddenly thrust into the national spotlight as the story gained traction on social media. The image of would-be thieves fleeing from an indignant library cat had captured public imagination in ways that legal briefs and academic papers never could. "There's something else," Ava said, looking up from her phone. "I just got a call from a courthouse clerk. Judge Harrison has scheduled an emergency evidentiary hearing for tomorrow morning. All parties are required to present their claims and supporting documentation." "That's fast," Nora said. "Too fast," Eli agreed. Emergency hearings usually mean someone with influence made a phone call. Maya had been running background checks on everyone involved in the case, her IT skills proving invaluable for mapping connections between the various players. What she found was disturbing. Judge Harrison received a campaign contribution from Red Cedar Minerals last election cycle, she reported. Alcott's museum board includes 3 major Red Cedar investors, and Professor Seeger's research fund received an anonymous donation of $50,000 last week. "They're trying to buy the outcome," Juania said quietly. "Then we'd better make sure the truth is loud enough to be heard over the sound of money." Nora replied. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in hallways and straining to hear through doors propped open to accommodate the overflow crowd. What had started as a quiet property dispute had become something much larger, a referendum on who gets to write history, and who gets silenced when their version becomes inconvenient. Judge Harrison looked overwhelmed by the attention, clearly unprepared for the media scrutiny that Ava's reporting had attracted. Camera crews from 3 different news networks had set up outside, and reporters with press credentials were documenting every procedural detail, with the intensity usually reserved for murder trials. Director Alcott's legal team occupied an entire row, their matching briefcases and coordinated suits, projecting the kind of expensive competence that usually intimidated small-town opposition. Red Cedar's lawyers filled another section, while Professor Seeger sat alone at a small table, looking increasingly uncomfortable as people filed past him with expressions of barely contained contempt. Nora, Eli, and Juania shared the defendant's table with a single lawyer, a young public defender named Sarah Chen, who'd volunteered to represent them pro bono after reading Ava's articles. She was outnumbered 20-1, but her preparation was meticulous and her confidence unshakable. Your Honor, Alcott's lead counsel began. This case involves the theft and fraudulent authentication of museum property. My client has documentation proving that these so-called treaty documents were removed from our secure storage without authorization. Present your evidence, Judge Harrison said wearily. What followed was an hour of carefully crafted lies and selective documentation. Alcott's team presented purchase orders for miscellaneous historical documents dating back decades, catalog entries for materials that might have included the treaty scrolls, and insurance records for items stored in their archive. But when Sarah Chen began her cross-examination, the fabrication crumbled under scrutiny. Ms. Alcott, she said politely, can you identify any specific reference to the treaty documents in question in any of these catalogue entries? The materials were catalogued as miscellaneous historical documents pending proper evaluation. So you have no record of specifically owning a treaty between Governor Whitmore and Running Wolf? Not specifically, no. And can you explain why materials supposedly in your secure storage were available for purchase at a parish estate sale? Alcott's composure began to crack. The documents may have been misfiled for 37 years. These things happen in large institutions. The gallery murmured at this, and Judge Harrison had to call for order. Jonah Park's testimony was devastating to the authenticity challenge. His forensic analysis had been thorough and professionally documented, and his credentials were impeccable. More importantly, his quiet integrity came through clearly as he walked the court through his methodology and findings. In my expert opinion, he concluded, these documents are authentic 19th century materials consistent with the claimed provenance. The level of sophistication required to forge such materials would far exceed any reasonable motivation for fraud. But it was Wania's testimony that transformed the hearing from a property dispute into something approaching a truth and reconciliation proceeding. She spoke in both English and Lakota, her voice carrying the weight of generations as she read passages from the treaty and explained their cultural significance. These are not just legal documents, she said, looking directly at Judge Harrison. They are sacred promises made by my ancestors to people who are now trying to destroy the very land those promises were meant to protect. Sheriff Briggs presented the chain of custody evidence with methodical precision, documenting every step from the parish sale to the attempted theft. Her photographs and witness statements created an unshakable timeline that demolished the competing ownership claims. Father Cruz's testimony was brief but powerful. He presented the original 1987 ledger entry documenting the legal transfer of materials from the Whitmore estate, along with decades of careful record-keeping that proved the church's legitimate ownership. We are custodians, he said simply. We preserve what others might discard, and we share what we preserve with those who need it most. When Red Cedar's lawyers attempted to argue that the company had purchased land rights that included any historical materials found on the property, Sarah Chen dismantled their logic with surgical precision. Your Honor, Red Cedar is claiming ownership of documents that predate their land purchase by over a century. Documents that specifically describe restrictions on the very land they now claim to own. Absolutely. Judge Harrison looked thoughtful. It does seem somewhat circular to claim that purchasing restricted land gives you the right to destroy the documents that establish the restrictions. After 4 hours of testimony, arguments and evidence presentation, the judge called for a recess to review the materials. The crowd spilled out onto the courthouse steps, where Ava continued her live coverage, and community supporters shared food and stories while they waited. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison's decision was careful but clear. This court finds that the plaintiffs have failed to establish superior ownership claims to the documents in question. The defendants have demonstrated clear chain of custody from legitimate purchase through proper authentication procedures. Furthermore, The attempted theft of these materials suggests consciousness of guilt on the part of parties claiming rightful ownership. He paused, looking around the packed courtroom. However, the cultural and historical significance of these documents extends beyond simple property rights. This court hereby establishes a temporary injunction preventing any land development activities on the areas described in the treaty pending further historical and cultural evaluation. The gallery erupted in applause and cheers. But Judge Henderson wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court recognizes the descendant community's legitimate interest in determining how their ancestors' agreements should be preserved and shared. Any future decisions regarding these documents must include meaningful consultation with the affected tribal community. It wasn't complete victory, but it was enough. The immediate threats had been neutralized, and the documents would remain in community custody while their full implications were explored through proper channels. 6 months after the courthouse victory, the tribal community center hummed with quiet celebration. Children's voices mixed with elders' laughter as families gathered around display cases that held both history and hope. The treaty documents rested behind museum-quality glass, their Lakota and English text accompanied by audio recordings of tribal members reading "Running." Wolf's words in languages that had survived everything empires could. Throw at them. Nora stood in the back of the room, watching Wania guide visitors through the exhibition with the patience of someone who understood that real education took time. The digital archive had launched that morning, complete with full chain of custody documentation, scholarly annotations, and most importantly, community authorship that placed descendant voices at the center of their own story. Quite a change from 6 months ago, Eli observed, joining her near the refreshment table, where Maya was explaining backup protocols to a group of interested archivists. His garage lab had been replaced by a proper conservation facility funded by settlement money from Red Cedar's suspended mining project. "The work's just beginning," Nora replied, but she was smiling. Universities from across the region had reached out about collaborative fellowships that would be named for 1 year's teachers. More importantly, 3 other tribal communities had contacted them about similar document recovery projects. Gutenberg appeared at her feet as if summoned, now wearing an official library cat badge and looking entirely too pleased with his role in changing history. Father Cruz had renamed the parish reading room the Community Archives, and Gutenberg had appointed himself head of security. Near the entrance, Ava Redbird interviewed visitors for a documentary she was producing about community-controlled preservation. Her regional newspaper had won a state journalism award for the coverage. But more satisfying was the network of small-town reporters who'd started investigating their own local mysteries. Sheriff Briggs paused beside them, off-duty, but still watching everything with professional interest. "Red Cedar's board voted to suspend the Ridge project indefinitely," she reported. "Something about changed community relations and regulatory uncertainty. Kincaid's been reassigned to their Wyoming operations. And Alcott retired to pursue other opportunities. The museum board demanded a complete audit of acquisitions after the break-in scandal. Turns out they've been a lot less careful about provenance than their marketing claimed. One display case remained covered, its contents visible only to community members who'd been granted specific permission. The ceremonial portions of the treaty carried restrictions that outsiders needed to respect. A reminder that transparency didn't mean everything belonged to everyone. "We got lucky," Nora said quietly. "We got organized," Wania corrected, approaching with a small group of visitors in tow. "Luck is what people call it when preparation meets opportunity, meets people willing to do the work." As the afternoon wore on and families filtered through the exhibition, Nora found herself thinking about the ripple effects of $6 discoveries and curious cats. The community provenance fund she'd established with her portion of the settlement was already helping small archives secure proper storage and digitization equipment. Jonah Park had left the Metropolitan Museum to establish an independent conservation lab that prioritized community ownership over institutional control. Even Professor Seeger had faced consequences. His plagiarism exposed and his funding suspended, pending a university ethics review. Sometimes justice moves slowly, but it moved. As the day wound down and cleanup began, Father Cruz approached with an envelope that bore the return address of another small-town parish 3 counties over. "This arrived yesterday," he said with a familiar twinkle in his eyes. "Seems they're cleaning out their courthouse attic and found some boxes that might interest you. Something about territorial surveys and mining claims that don't match current ownership records." Nora and Wanya exchanged a look that contained entire conversations about responsibility, risk, and the ongoing work of reclaiming silenced histories. "Well," Wanya said finally, "I suppose someone should take a look." Gutenberg meowed his agreement and headed toward the door, clearly ready for the next adventure. Some battles ended, but the work of preserving truth was never finished. In a world where powerful people routinely buried inconvenient facts, someone had to keep digging them back up. History, it turned out, was not a museum piece to be preserved behind glass. It was a living thing that needed tending, defending, and above all, sharing with the people who had the most right to know its secrets. The lost library had found its purpose at last. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.